Hey folks, welcome. A quick intro here. This lecture and the next one were originally planned as a single lecture, mostly focusing on adding OAuth support to your server. But as it turned out, I really felt the need to first set some baseline expectations on what a sample end-to-end system would look like, including a website, a mobile app, and a web API, all accessing the same backend. So this first video is just that. Creating a simple end-to-end system with just ASP.NET Identity protecting the website and no security at all on the other parts. In part 2, the much more complicated part, we'll look at adding OAuth server capabilities to our website with Identity Server and consuming the authentication in our mobile app and web API. So without further delay, let's get started on part 1.
Okay guys, so the whole idea is that we're going to be dealing with a situation or simulating a situation here where we have a pre-existing website and we're going to be adding some security to that website or adding some authorization infrastructure to that website that can be shared across our web API and therefore also to our mobile app. We're going to further assume that we have a website that already has some infrastructure, some actual logging in required and some roles in that website. And we're probably doing that with ASP.NET Identity. We may or may not be, but let's assume that. Let's build on that assumption. And we'll start then with a new project that actually has, we're just going to create a from scratch website that has ASP.NET Identity like yours may. And then we're going to look at how we can layer on top of that the things we need to allow our web API and our mobile device to also log in using those same credentials, sharing the credentials, sharing the roles across all those environments. Okay, so first things is we're going to create that solution, that web project. And we're not going to do core today, although actually you could follow along with almost everything we're doing with ASP.NET Core. We're going to use a solution that is very, very, very much common across both ASP.NET 4.5 and with core as well. So you actually could do either way. That's why we picked this solution, is because it works very well in both environments. For now, though, I'm going to stick with the classic. And in here, I'm going to just name this my website with securities. With security spelled in such a cool way, because that's the kind of guy I am. All right, and this is going to be an MVC project, so we can see that we have our MVC setting checked here. And we'll make sure our authentication is set to individual user accounts. This is what's going to create our ASP.NET Identity infrastructure for us, is by having this set up, then our template is just going to create that for us. Hit OK and hit OK. Alright, so now we have basically a working website that we can actually create an account and log into, though it doesn't do much interesting beyond that. Let's take a quick tour around what the template created for us. Of course, it created a basic controller that basically has a hello, how are you, and the account, because we did create our user account, so that's our controller for actually logging in and creating our user account. We won't worry too much about that. What it also created, if we come down here, we see a startup class. And the startup class, we just see a method called configuration. And importantly, we see this attribute, Owen startup attribute, pointed at this very class. What this means is that when my application domain gets kicked off here, this method is going to be run. And this whole Owen startup thing is all part of the new configuration, the new pipeline that ASP.NET is using now and adding. In fact, ASP.NET Core really uses this pipeline very much at its heart. Here in ASP.NET 4.5, we're not using it for much yet, but we are using it. Let's see what configure auth does. That's over here on our app start, and startup auth. There's configure auth in my startup auth. Notice that this is the other part of the partial class startup. And then here, this is where everything about ASP.NET Identity is set up. So we can see that we actually use some sort of dependency injection type framework built right in to our own framework. And so we're actually registering certain classes to be used by the framework, to be used throughout the run of the application. And so we see we have an application DB context. This is our database context so that things get read and written to the database for our users. And then our application user manager and sign-in manager. We don't need to dive deep into this stuff, but this is where all of our authentication stuff is set up. And we're going to be working further in here in order to tack on what we need to tack on to allow our mobile app and our web API to also authenticate here. For right now, though, I just want to focus on doing a few things to make our development life easier, since we're not developing a real production application here, and because we need to make this go a little bit smoothly for demo purposes. Let's get rid of our two-factor requirement. And let's also follow to our user manager here. Go to the definition of our user manager. And we're also going to get rid of the complex requirements for my password. So we can just use password as a password. Okay, now the next thing I just want to do is go and create ourselves a model that we can have our app, have our whole demo do something a little bit interesting with beyond what the template created for us. So let me just go ahead and create a model. And we're going to keep this super simple. We're just going to create a customer model. And it's going to have an ID and name. And now let's create a controller for our model. Let's go ahead and do one more thing to our customer model here. We got some things open. Let's set that ID field to have a couple properties within Entity Framework, or attributes that can be read by Entity Framework. First of all, I'm going to make it my key attribute. We're going to need our using statements there. And I'm going to actually have this be database generated. And now it's time to do a quick demo of our website, complete with the ability to add customers. Better resize our browser window so it fits on my bonus size Tonka truck screen here. It's my Duplo screen, actually. It's everything's jumbo sized so you guys can see it on the recording. All right, so let's go ahead and register first of all. And we're going to create ourselves a test at tester.com account. And register. Of course, I need to add my password correctly. Okay, and since later on we're going to actually be sharing those database connections, I want to modify my development database so that it's using SQL Express instead of LocalDB. SQL Express I'll be able to more easily share across different running applications. We'll also need to get rid of the attach DB file name parameter here, since again we're going to be sharing the database. In particular, the domain model context one, which we will be sharing. We'll need to get rid of that attach DB file name because this is relative to this project's directory. So instead, we'll just allow the database to be created on the SQL Server instance itself rather than being loaded from file. Get rid of that. That'll have it created on the SQL Server Express instance itself. And it doesn't hurt to actually go ahead and do it with this one as well, though it's not as important since we won't be sharing this database. Our user database will actually be driven entirely from this application. What we're going to do then is just modify our properties here to run in IIS. We're going to need this anyway so that our application is actually accessible from outside of our computer and is accessible by, for instance, our mobile device or mobile simulator, even for testing mode. So let's go to web, and we're going to be running on IIS, local IIS here. All right, let that create our virtual directory. Okay. And go ahead and give our website a run, and we'll be able to see that we can interact with our registration, we can interact with our customers. Let's go ahead and register. I do need to get those passwords to match. Ah, it already has us in there. Excellent. Hello, test@tester.com. So now we can also go to that customers controller. And start creating customers. I'm going to have a Spacely Sprockets. And we'll add a Cogswell Cogs. Bonus points if you know the references. All right, we've got our customers. Now we've got some data that we can interact with. Now we'll be able to log in, we'll be able to check out our customers, and we'll be able to do this now through our web API once we have one, check it out in our mobile app. So let's start adding those other projects, shall we? All right, guys, so at this point, we have our website with securities as it happens. And now we're going to add our web API. This is going to be another project that can access the same data, that can interact with the same data. And it's what we're going to use from our mobile app to go and access this data. But of course, the web API will be a RESTful or roughly RESTful interface for doing that versus a website, which just serves up, of course, HTML type pages. All right, so let's go ahead and add a new project here. Once again, ASP.NET Web Application, and here we'll just call it Web API using securities. And so this is the part where we'll change things up a little bit. So I will say Web API, and again we're in the ASP.NET 4.5 templates here. So Web API, we can see that that will create MVC core references. We don't need to worry about that. It's fine as long as we have these ones. That's the important bit here. Now over here we can go and we can tell this one no authentication. We're going to be adding in the authentication ourselves. All right, set up no authentication. Okay, and we're ready. We don't need to host in the cloud, though of course We do have Azure classes if you guys want to learn about hosting your projects in the cloud, having this directly create a web app on Azure's web service, cloud service, then by all means check out those classes. For right now, we're going to keep things simple, of course, and run things locally. All right, so this once again is actually going to create us some default controllers. We see a values controller, something that's just boring and will return some stuff so that we could browse to it and actually have a working, if boring and useless, web API. We're going to actually change that up a little bit. We're going to want, of course, a customer's controller. We want to be accessing the same data that that website is accessing, right? So in order to do that, though, remember, since we're wanting to access the same data, we're going to end up accessing the same database. Now, depending on how elaborate you want your architecture to be, you may want to create some more checks in place and not have two projects accessing the same database, but instead have maybe yet a further layer that is in charge of kind of the gateway to that database. But it really depends on how elaborate your architecture needs to be. It might be perfectly acceptable, and it's often perfectly acceptable, to use the expediency of having two applications, a web API and a website, interacting with the same underlying SQL server. And that's what we're going to do today. But in order to accomplish that, we're going to actually go ahead and end up sharing our data model and even our entity framework data context for that customer model. So I'm going to end up creating a library project here that's going to be referenced from both of my website and my web API projects. So once again, new project. And this is just going to be a regular old DLL. So let's find a class library here. And we'll just call this our customers model. There's no securities involved in this layer, so we don't need to put anything about securities. It's just our customers model. Hit OK. Okay, so now we're going to move some things that we originally defined in our website. We're going to move them over to this shared model, okay? And this might be something if you started in your real world scenario with a website and then migrated later to having a web API as well, this might be exactly the type of refactoring you'd really want to do. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to ignore the default class that was created there, or heck, we can even go ahead and delete it. It's pretty useless. And we will add now a folder, and I'll just call this models. And into that, I am going to move my customer. Cut. Paste. All right, so already now this is going to be angry because it no longer knows how to get a customer. So let's go ahead and make sure it's got the references it needs. Now the other thing, where do we get our customers from? We get them from the database, and we access the database through a data context. And so we'll also need to share our data context. There's that domain model context that we conveniently created separately earlier. Now, you may, in fact, if you were doing a refactor in the real world, have your ASP.NET Identity stuff and your domain model all kind of wrapped up in the same data context, in which case you may need to refactor things a little bit there, split them out, separate them out, right? There's a lot of different ways to handle these things, so we're only going over one scenario. You may actually require an additional step shredding those things out. For right now, we're actually set up to just do it, so I'm going to go ahead and move this over. All right, let's do a rebuild. We're probably going to have some usings and stuff that we need to fix. since we've moved things around and moved namespaces around a little bit. Yeah, so as we can see, we need some usings here. We need some actually references as well in our shared class library here, because we're referencing some entity framework projects, some entity framework DLLs, which by default our class libraries don't do. So fortunately, we have our NuGet to come to the rescue for us, and we'll just go find entity framework. Install. All right, let's see how that rebuild does now. One succeeded. Let's redo the website as well. There we go, succeeded. And let's go ahead and run the website. We'll confirm everything is still hunky-dory. And we'll make sure we can still get to our customers page there. Fantastic. Let's add this same functionality now into our web API. Add my reference. And now add a controller. We want a web API controller this time, of course, and we're going to have it interact directly with our database. So let's go ahead and say we want to use the entity framework. Now we should, because we added the reference, be able to find our customer in the list here and the appropriate data context as well. Async is a good idea. And we hit add. So this time we've got the issue of not having a connection string as part of our API project. We of course have our connection string in our website with securities, but we don't have it in our web API with securities. So let's go ahead and copy that over. And all I need to do to make that happen, open up the two web configs. And we can see, of course, that my website already has one for domain model context, a connection strings. So let's grab that. And copy it over. Okay, now let's add that controller, shall we? Back in our web API project, add controller, web API 2 controller, entity framework, customer, domain model context, async, and add it. All right, if we take a look, we'll see that it's got pretty much the kind of basic actions we'd expect. Get customer, get customers, right? Plural and singular by ID. We can do puts and posts. So exactly what we'd expect, and of course deletes. We're going to now switch our startup project and take a look at this web API. Start. All right, so this is just the basic splash screen that we have. In fact, to have this splash screen is the whole reason that it actually, when we first started, saw that it included MVC templates as well as web API templates so that we could have a splash screen. All right, our API itself is actually going to, most importantly, contain our customers API. Let's get customers by following that path. And look at that. We've got Spacely Sprockets and Cogswell Cogs, so we are now interacting directly with the same data that we interacted with through our website. Now we are able to see it through web API. Now, of course, right now it's returning XML. Fortunately, our web API is flexible. It can do JSON or XML. Now, what I want to do is point out that we do still want security on this. And at this point, we haven't actually added any security. So anyone using a browser without any security is able to just browse to that endpoint, that web API endpoint, and see our customers list. Well, that's no good. Now, the way we can add security, the way we can at least require security on an individual controller is to simply require authorization. So I can open up my controller and I can just say that to use any method on this, you have to be authorized. And that's what adding that attribute is going to require. Now, there's a lot more we can do with this attribute, but just right off the bat, now this says that only an authenticated user can use any of these methods, any of these web API endpoints. Now, how do we authenticate a user? Well, at the beginning of this project, of course, we selected no authentication. We didn't want any of it bootstrapped for us. We're taking control of that. And that's where things are going to start getting interesting. Well, since we're going to have a pretty bad time if we leave that authorize attribute in place requiring authentication when we don't actually have a way to authenticate, let's go ahead and comment that out for now. And before we jump into the authentication business and getting our authentication integrated between web API and our mobile app and our website, let's first get ourselves a mobile app. We don't quite have that yet, do we? So add new project, and we're just going to do an iOS app for our little demo here today. iOS, iPhone, and we'll do a single view app, and I'll just call this iOS app using securities. Notice a trend on our naming convention? All right, now before we can actually open up our storyboard, I'm going to need to connect to my Mac, so let's get that done. Okay, so here we are. Let's hit close on our connection panel, and now I can open up my storyboard. And we're going to have a pretty boring little iOS app here for our demo purposes. We'll have a button that'll kick off our web service call, and we're just going to have then a UI label that will show our output. Let's make this fill up most of our screen, other than, of course, the button. And I'm literally going to name these guys the label and the button because, you know, that's fun. Do stuff. And my label here, let's have that go right up close to the button. And let's get some appropriate constraints in place here. We'll just have that go there, and it can go ahead and have constant height and constant width. And then my label here will go ahead and fill out the remainder of the screen. And if we give things a look really quick here, set this as my startup project, and I'm going to make sure that my Windows emulator for iOS is in fact set up. There we go. Let's go ahead and of course select what device we're simulating here and press play. This is of course our Windows iOS simulator, our iOS simulator for Windows from Xamarin. So this actually connects to the simulator on your Mac and kind of forwards the visuals, so we can actually click our buttons, interact with it completely. So very, very nice to not have to switch over to a remote Mac desktop or vice versa. And the way things are looking is that we are all set and ready to go. It's not obviously a very impressive UI here, but it will do the job. So let's hit stop right there. And I'm just going to actually, let's give our button a name first. Then I'll double click on that. I'm just going to call it the button. I know, pretty boring. And update, wait for it. And I'm going to call my label, bet you can guess, the label. Actually, you know what? How about the output, since it's going to be our output. All right, let's make the default text just be maybe blank. All right, and now save and double click my button. And that's going to, of course, generate an action for me. So here, what we're going to do is connect to our web service. Now, I'm going to create an HTTP client instance here, and what I want to do is connect to my web API. However, there are a couple wrinkles here. So let's start by just creating my HTTP client. And at this point, we're going to have to start to think about these wrinkles. Let me get my using in here. So I will say var output equals http.get string async. All right, now here is my wrinkle. What do I put for my URI? Now, it would seem that I could just use what was opening up when I opened up Web API in my browser when I was debugging that. However, here's the trick. My iOS app, even though I'm running it apparently in an emulator here on my Windows machine, is actually executing on my Mac. And we're just forwarding the views back over to the Windows machine. So it's actually my Mac and the simulator on my Mac that needs access to this website, meaning I can't just use localhost. All right, so I'm going to have to use the IP address, and it's going to have to be accessible externally from this machine. So let's go back into my web API here and go to its setup options. And in the debug section of this, or rather the web section of this, we're going to make sure that we're set to the local IIS, and that's going to set up our web API using security subdirectory here, and that's going to work just fine. Make sure we create that virtual directory. It was created successfully. Wonderful. This should be fine. I can save that. We could confirm again that we can run our web API before continuing. And also, that actually does us the favor of showing us, again in our browser, what the path is. So we'll just kind of copy and paste that. So let's set that as startup project. Comment that out for now. And once again, let's just browse to our API/customers. Okay, still looks good. Everything's still okay. You'll notice now we're not using the IIS Express, so instead of having a funny port, we've just got the extra subdirectory going on. So that's perfect. And so this is going to be the path we want. We'll grab that as part of what we need in our get string call. All right, the rest of what we're going to need for my get string async here, I'm going to need obviously my IP address here or a machine name, but we're going to use IP address. That's just a little bit more flexible to make sure things work. And in my case, you guys can run ipconfig. You're not going to be able to copy my IP address because you'll have your own. So in my case, my IP address is that. And so now my HTTP client should successfully connect to my web API, should successfully download the customers string there, and I'm just going to await this since it is an async and await method. Do that correctly. And now I can set the output, that's my label, set its text to equal output. And we should have either XML or JSON representing our Spacely sprockets and Cogswell cogs showing up in our iOS device. So let us set that back to startup. And let's give it a look. Press our button, and there's our JSON, Spacely sprockets. We can see that we actually need to modify our label a little bit. That's okay, we can do that. But otherwise, everything's looking pretty good. We're connecting to our web API. Let's review, right? Let's recap this. We're connecting from a mobile app, our iOS app, to a web API, a REST endpoint, and downloading data that was actually entered. We did the data entry in a separate website project. Of course, that's because they're sharing the same database. So everybody is playing nicely together at this point. We have these 3 different projects. In fact, 4 if we count our class library. We have these projects all playing nicely together and sharing data. Of course, they're not sharing an authentication model yet. Right now, only our website supports authentication. I want to share that, all those credentials, all those roles. I want to be able to share that to the web API and to the mobile app.
That's it for part 1, folks. Tune in for part 2 where we'll add authentication support to the rest of our projects using OAuth. Bye for now.